Now that the prototyping work is done, it's time to fabricate all the pieces for the full sculpture. Savina's brother Llorenç is over on a visit, and they're both turning out to be great assistants. In the shop, there's multiple operations going on all at once, but in this video we'll go through each component one by one. We'll start with the slat pieces. They're going to be painted white to match with the wall, which will help to emphasize the moving parts of the sculpture. So to prepare for the first coat of paint, we'll sand all the surfaces. We worked out a system for holding the slats in place under the belt sander with little dowels inserted into the work surface that match up with the pre-existing holes in the slats. And I finish off the sanding by roughening up the edges too. Now going through each piece one by one with a vacuum to make sure we have dust-free surfaces for painting. We're doing 2 coats of flat white paint. We'll start with the faces. Now to paint the edges of the slats, we've got a clever system for doing them all at once. A set of slats is held together with 2 dowels, and in between each slat are washers to keep them adequately spaced apart so the paint doesn't adhere them all together. And we'll also give 2 coats of white paint to the brackets that the sculpture will hang on. So that's it for the lattice fabrication. Now the next component to work on are the blocks that mount onto the lattice and support the pivoting rods. I'll cross-cut the blanks from square stock on the table saw. And I'll punch marks on the faces and the edges of each of the blocks for drilling holes. I've got a little jig here with slots that are the right size for the blocks with nails in the center sticking up to make the punch. Starting with a punch helps to ensure we drill on center, but even so, the punch isn't all that precise, and going into the end grain like this, the hole doesn't always end up right where you want it. So we're drilling halfway from one side, flipping it over, and then finishing from the other side. And these pieces don't need to be that precise anyways to do their job of supporting the rods well. And now for each of the blocks, 2 coats of white paint, same as the lattice to help them blend into the background. And similar to before, we've got a system for helping us to paint multiple faces all at once. And with that, the blocks should be done, but I can't resist trying to make one more improvement to the design. I'm concerned about friction in the ends of the metal rods that are supposed to pivot freely. As it is now, the ends of the rods rest only on the machine screw that goes through the block. It's not a really clean interface. So my idea is to use little pieces of square tubing to serve as a kind of bushing. The top face of the square tube should provide a nicer surface for the end of the rod to rest on. And because they're flat, should help it pivot more freely. So this means I'm going to need to re-drill the holes in the blocks so that they're big enough to fit the bushings. Should be simple enough to do, and I think the results are going to be worth it. I even did a rough side-by-side comparison to see just how much this reduces the friction. I tried to use approximately the same amount of force for each case. And the one with the bushing lasted about 3 times as long, so I thought, that's clear enough. Here I've got a little crosscut sled I've built for the Dremel. I'll use it to cut all the bushing pieces from the square tube stock. With all the pieces cut, I'd like to do something about the burrs, but instead of sanding or filing each one, I'll just kind of rub them together a little bit. Hopefully they'll grind against each other somewhat and smooth off the cut edges. And now to widen the center holes in each of the blocks to accommodate the bushing. I'm trying to take care not to damage the finished paint job in the process. Now I'll re-drill the center hole and kind of ream it to get rid of any chip out from widening of the center hole, or any paint drips that fell in the vertical hole for that matter. And here's the last step, inserting each of the bushings. They're a snug fit in the holes in the block, so it takes a fair bit of force to insert them. And I want to get the alignment just right, so I built a little key to help with that process. Slide the insert over the key, line it up, press it in, remove the key, and there you go. Now the blocks are done. Next piece is the discs. They start as 2-inch round dowel stock cross-cut on the table saw. Now we're taking the cut blanks and center punching each one in preparation for drilling. Each disc gets a hole drilled in the center about halfway through, which allows it to join with the pivoting rod to serve as a counterweight on both ends. But first we make use of this hole for the next step, rough sanding. We got the idea to mount the drill to the workbench to help mechanize the sanding process. The disc is just wedged onto a dowel held in the chuck. Now that the sanding's done, I'll go through and clean each piece to prepare for paint and finish. The discs on the front side of the sculpture are going to be painted blue. The ones on the back side are just going to be varnished. But the ones on the front aren't actually going to be painted completely blue. Just the front face is going to be painted blue. The edges and the back side will be varnished as well. So here we're applying varnish everywhere except for the select faces that are going to get blue paint. And here goes the first coat of blue paint. To help apply it uniformly, we've come up with this spinning platform using a Lazy Susan mechanism. Notice how we've spared the top face of the disc from varnish, so the blue paint has a chance to adhere. After the first coat is dry, it's back to the drill for another round of sanding. And then, of course, after the sanding, clean off the dust. And finally, the second coat of blue. This is a high-gloss version of the blue, so it should be more durable and better stand up to being touched when people come and play with the sculpture. With the discs done, the next component to fabricate are the upright metal rods. They start out from bar stock, being cut to length. To make the cuts, we set up a kind of table for the angle grinder with the cutoff wheel protruding out from a slot, with a fence and a stop block to repeat the same length for each cut. Now we've changed out the cutoff wheel to a thicker grinding wheel to clean up the cut ends of the rods. And on one end of each of the rods, what's going to be the bottom end, we're doing an extra smooth round over to help it to pivot freely. Now each rod gets a hole drilled through the middle of it. And then a pass with the countersink bit to clean up the rough edges of the holes. And that's it for the rods. Next are the pivots, which begin as oak dowel rod. First we cross-cut all the pieces to length on the table saw. And then carve out the slots in the middle, just as with the prototype. Next, we drill a hole across the slot, which will receive the pin that allows it to pivot. So the middle portion of all the pivots is done, and now it's time to prepare the ends where the springs will attach. Each shaft will have 6 connection points on both ends, and the connection points are formed by hammering little divots with a screwdriver evenly spaced around the circumference. And we finish them off with a coat of varnish. Now all the individual parts are done, and it's time to start assembling the pivoting rod sets together. Using a small nail as a pin, connect the metal shaft to the wooden rod, then cut the end of the nail off, nearly flush, and using a ball peen hammer, flatten and round over the cut off end of the nail to lock it in place as a rivet. Now I'm going to cut the split rings. They start from a tightly wound coil of wire that's just the right diameter that allows it to slide over the ends of the wooden rods. Because their diameter is slightly undersized, they should hold themselves in place and not slide around too much. Each piece has more than one coil turn so that there's no gap and so that it behaves like a seamless belt. And so with all the split rings cut, we slide one over each end of all the pivoting rod assemblies. They're a bit fussy when you try to expand them and force them onto the end of the dowel, but once on, they hold themselves in place nicely by constriction. And now to finish them off, we'll glue on the end caps. It's important that the assembly be well balanced so it doesn't have a tendency to tip to one side or the other. And my original plan to balance the assemblies was by adjusting the depth that the rod is inserted into the cap, so effectively shifting these counterweights closer or farther from the pivot point. But after doing a number of assemblies like that, I found that it wasn't always enough. I didn't have enough adjustability that way. So I went through and sorted all the caps by weight, and then paired them up, a front cap with a back cap, each of similar weight, for an assembly, and after that they were all much easier to balance. I apply some glue to the holes of each of the caps, press them onto the rod, and before the glue dries, adjust the position of the caps as needed to get it to balance. And that's it for the pivot assemblies. Now all the wood and metalworking is done, all the painting and finishing is done, and only one component remains to be fabricated: the springs. I decided to use a threaded rod this time to coil the springs around so that they would come off already having formed in them a bit of spacing between the coils. Now that we've got what should be sufficient length of continuous spring formed, we've got to cut it all up into individual pieces. And for each cut length of spring, we'll form an arm and a hook on each end. Once that's done, everything should be ready for assembly and installation.